Night's Curse, a short story written by Justin M. Sloan, narrated by Rebecca Green. Annabelle never wanted the moment to end that Christmas Eve. Years later, she would look back with restless yearning for that night, but not for the next morning. 13-year-old Annabelle giggled on the couch beside her father, a thick blue snuggly wrapped around them, giving the impression of a fat wizard. She laughed again and pointed at the ridiculous get-up. He smiled back with a wink. His white hair was momentarily highlighted purple from the lights on the trim outside the window. Frosty the Snowman blared from the kitchen, escaping into the living room along with the scent of cinnamon and cloves. Annabelle let her eyes slip to the silver and gold sparkling Christmas tree near the door. Presents lay piled underneath, stockings hung along the wall on the other side of the door. "More than one this year?" she said with a hopeful side glance at the presents, the kind she knew he always fell for. Her mother entered with a tray of gingerbread cookies. "Don't let her sweet-talk you. Not this year." "She has plenty of presents," her father replied. "Dear?" Howard shrugged at Annabelle. "Sorry, honey, your mother has sweets." Annabelle poked her father's belly. "Sold me out for him again, huh?" They all laughed as her father reached for 2 cookies. One for him and one for Annabelle. Of course she got her way. And after opening a stuffed dog that she too grown up for, and a book she had never heard of, they sat among the wrapping paper and watched It's a Wonderful Life, because they never missed it on Christmas Eve. Soon Annabelle found herself yawning, and her mom agreed to tuck her into bed. "Don't go," Annabelle said. "Santa will be here soon." Annabelle yawned. Such fantasies had left her imagination long ago. "Give me a break." "You'll see, if you're good just one more night." Annabelle giggled as her mom rubbed noses. "Mom, stop it." "Too grown up for that now." Her mother smiled for longer than seemed natural, then reached for Annabelle's shoulder. Annabelle cringed, but her mother soothed her by brushing a hand against her forehead. She moved aside the cloth and cringed. "It really is getting better, though," her mother said as she assessed the scar Annabelle knew was there but didn't want to see. The scar from a camping trip in September. A dog, or something, had leapt from the shadows and bit her. Oddly, it had stopped then and paused to sniff her before retreating into the darkness. Her parents had found her screaming, but by the time they got her to the hospital, the bleeding had stopped and, as unbelievable as doctors said it was, had already begun to scab. She dreaded returning to school and being made fun of, but the scar wasn't revealed as long as she didn't wear a tank top. Being in Seattle, she didn't have to worry about the weather being too warm, and she often had to wear a sweater. Annabelle pulled away and covered the scar, avoiding her mother's gaze. Her mother moved to the door and paused by the light switch. "Sweet dreams, my little angel." Annabelle smiled sleepily, and her eyes closed. She dreamed of the Christmas last year, lying beside the tree after a full breakfast, her presents surrounding her, a glass of eggnog half drunk in her hand. She didn't have any cousins to celebrate with, no siblings either, and her grandparents lived 3 hours south in Oregon. But she always loved spending time with her parents, the blessing that was Christmas, the only time her father seemed to be able to escape his job at the pound. This year's expectations were especially high. The next morning she awoke to bright sunlight escaping through the cracks in her blinds. The fresh air of Christmas morning filled the room. The brum-pum-pum-pum from the little drummer boy beat in her head, and she giggled. She jumped out of bed and ran to the living room. She knew Santa didn't exist, but that didn't mean he wouldn't bring her some goodies in her stocking. Sure enough, her stocking was especially lumpy, and she knelt down to dump its contents on the floor. Before her lay chocolates, a tangerine, and a new Christmas ornament. She always looked forward to the Christmas ornament, wondering what her parents would find for her. This year, it was Santa with a dog in his lap. She had always wanted a dog. All those days visiting the pound, the dogs looking at her as if they were long-lost friends, the best friends. She wondered if this was a hint that it was forthcoming. She stood, and her foot sloshed in the dampness. She turned with a smile, ready to hang the ornament on the tree, and screamed. Her father's body lay on the drenched carpet, a mangled mess, his skin torn and chunks of flesh missing, blood everywhere. Annabelle felt the panic overtake her. Her skin tightened around her bones, and her chest collapsed in with her lungs. The room seemed to shudder. A thought struck her. Mom! She ran for her mother's open door, but froze halfway. A pair of legs, certainly her mother's, lay past the door in a puddle of blood. Annabelle stumbled back, her voice catching in an attempted scream. Bile soured her tongue. She felt for the walls, reaching for balance as she began to hyperventilate. A creak came from the open front door and sent tremors through Annabelle's nerves. She turned and sprinted through the hall and into her bedroom. She slammed her door shut with both hands and then stared at the red contrast of flaky blood on her hands against the white door. Blood caked under her fingernails. Stumbling back, she caught herself against the windowsill and retched. Wiping her mouth with her sheet, she looked back to the door, at the red handprints, and then down at her own hands again. None of it made sense. The only thought she could understand at the moment was the overwhelming urge to be away from that metallic stench of death, from the horror in the other room. She ran to the window and pushed, but her hand slid along its slick surface and she fell. With determination she stood. Amid the screams and tears, she pushed again. The window opened, and she pulled herself up and over into the backyard. The morning dew dampened her pajamas. The sunlight sparkled on the deep green grass. In the distance, across the field, the tree line she had so often played in with her school friends now seemed the only place to go. It became her sanctuary, her means of escape. She forced everything into her muscles as she pushed for those trees, as if entering the shadows of those hemlocks would make everything go away. She never seemed to stop running. The sun set and rose, and Annabelle continued on. And she ran and ran until one night when the moon rose to reveal a perfect circle, a full moon. And that's when it happened. That's when she first became aware of the transformation. It started as a burning in her nostrils until the scent of the dirt inches from her face overwhelmed her, surging through her insides. Her eyes stung, pulsing as if they would pop. As she screamed, her skin seemed to be tearing away from her flesh. She opened her eyes to see only black and white. Long hairs had sprouted on the back of her hands. She scratched at the hairs to get them off, but her fingernails had become claws, and her scratching pulled blood. The burning and the pain surged, and she screamed as loud as she could, her back arching and her muscles clenching. Then everything went black. She wasn't sure how much time had passed during that blackout, or what she had done. Over the following weeks, she avoided contact with people whenever possible. How could she look someone in the eye after what she was now sure she had done? The myths of the werewolf were no longer in question, neither was the rumor of them being born on Christmas Day. But her thoughts didn't dwell long on this. They were too consumed with the guilt over the death of her parents. The memory of their mutilation ate at her night and day. 2 weeks after the horrible night of her transformation, she found herself in the unfortunate space of a crowded street. Over her dingy pink pajamas, now dirty gray, she wore an oversized coat someone had given her. She held it over her head to keep off the light rain. People walked by, barely noticing the homeless child. Her hunger often got the best of her and forced her to roam the streets looking for leftovers, handouts, or when she was lucky, drop change. She liked to save up enough for a loaf of bread, and then keep the leftovers in her pockets until she really needed them. Last night she had finished off the last of a delicious cinnamon raisin loaf. As she searched the streets, wondering what corner to beg on, the best area to avoid the authorities who she had seen taking away another unsupervised child, she almost allowed herself to think she was lucky. A shiny quarter lay in a puddle not far off. She darted between a fat man in a suit and a woman that, had Annabel been a bit older, she would have known must have been a prostitute. Instead, Annabel's mind focused on the glint of light ahead. She reached for the quarter and almost had it when someone walked by and kicked it. The coin clinked against the cement not far off before rolling into another puddle. She took a step after it, but paused. In the reflection of a puddle, she saw a man staring at her. Her eyes rose to meet his. She pulled back at the intensity of those eyes, kind as they seemed. A series of scars fell from the upper left of his face to the lower right. He smiled, the smile of one who's found their long-lost dog. She turned at this and briskly walked away. She glanced over her shoulder to see him still standing there and watching her, still smiling. He couldn't be a cop, not looking like that, so why was he watching her? She had heard stories, tales worse than being taken by the cops. She broke into a jog and turned a corner into a side street where she promptly collided with a boy not much older than herself. He stumbled back and caught himself on the white brick wall. His frown, however, faded to a smile when he looked up to see her. "Watch it," he said. She glanced at him, deciding she didn't like his thick eyebrows and the way his hair stuck straight up. Before turning to go, she noticed him pocketing something, and a large man at a truck behind him. As she took her first step, the boy brushed past her and took off in a jog. She stared, confused, until she heard pounding footsteps behind her. "You two, not so fast!" a booming voice said from the direction of the large man. He started for her, and she turned to see the boy smirk as he disappeared into the crowd and the rain. Before the man's meaty hands could reach her, she darted after the boy, cursing her luck. People yelled after the two as they ran, the man close behind. Annabel nearly slipped, then shrieked as her foot hit a puddle and the water covered her leg, but she wasn't going to get caught for someone else's mistake. Behind her, she heard a woman shriek as a large man shoved people aside and yelled after them, "Thieves!" It wasn't fair. She hadn't done anything. But then, not much in her life was fair lately. Certainly the discovery that she was some sort of mutation, a werewolf that had likely killed her own parents, that wasn't lucky. For a moment she thought she had lost the boy, but as she came around the edge of a building she saw his spiky hair disappearing over a wall. She followed, landing on the other side to see the boy hunched on the ground beside her. His eyes rose, wide with surprise, and then narrowed as he stood. The man appeared behind them, and this time Annabel wasn't waiting to see where the boy went. She sprinted to a fence, then jumped halfway up. Grabbing the chain links and propelling herself up, she almost allowed herself to smile at her skills. The fence shook, and she heard the boy's voice yelling for help. "Let me go!" the boy yelled from below, and she looked to see that the man had the boy's shoe. After a moment's hesitation, Annabel dropped several links before grabbing hold and kicking out. She grunted at the effort, but was pleased to feel her foot make contact exactly where she expected the man's head to be. He yelled some obscenity as she and the boy scaled the fence and jumped for a nearby building's ledge, landing at an open window. "Little brats!" The deep voice followed them in as they escaped into the window. They entered a vacant building and quickly found their way out the other side to a deserted street. "This way," the boy said as he led her across the street and to a covered parking lot. He lowered himself over the ledge to drop down to a lower level, and she followed. The rain dripped nearby, blocked from the parking level above them. The boy sat against the wall, breathing heavily, while she paced, her energy divided between trying to catch her breath and glaring at him. "You could have gotten us in trouble," she said, her chest heaving. The boy shrugged. "Didn't, though." "Yeah, but you coulda." "But I didn't, did I?" He looked her over, as if assessing her worth. "I'm Danny, by the way." She couldn't stop glaring at him as she paced. She wanted to tackle him, to slam him against that cement wall and leave him in the rain, but her curiosity was too strong. "What'd you take, anyway?" Danny pulled a wallet from his pocket. "Lunch?" He stood and walked to the parking lot exit on the far side. "You coming or what?" Her stomach rumbled. She knew her hatred for Danny would have to be put aside for the moment. She followed him to the restaurant, where they sat at a wooden table covered in plates of food. There was cornbread, peas, mashed potatoes, and ribs. She avoided the ribs and responded to his questioning glance by explaining that she was a vegetarian. "That's so." She continued to eat, not paying him much attention. She didn't look at the rain trickling along the glass windows, or the other customers' eyes on her filthy clothes. All she cared about was getting food in her belly and ignoring her past, forgetting that night. "Have you always been, a vegetarian?" She paused in her chewing for a moment, then went on without answering. "First we've got to get you clothes, better clothes." She looked at him, confused. "First? If we're going to take care of you." She swallowed her food. "Why? Why would you want to help me?" Danny cocked his head and stared at her, then nodding, as if telling himself it was okay. "There are others like you, like us." She stared back, unsure how to interpret what he was saying. "Come on." He stood and moved for the door. She didn't follow. "You prefer to be alone? The streets?" She glanced at the food. "Right." He turned to the waiter. "Waiter, doggy bag." She was hesitant to let him take the food, but in the end she followed Danny in the prospect of more food and clean clothes. Most of all, she wanted to know what he had meant when he said, "like us." They left the city behind and walked along the tree-lined path, the branches above blocking out the drops of rain. Neither said a word. The only noise aside from the pitter-patter of the rain was the sloshing of Danny's shoes in the mud. They passed a bend in the path, and Danny paused, motioning to a rickety house in the distance. "That's it," he said. She followed with trepidation. With each step she told herself to turn and run, but her curiosity was too strong. When he opened the door, she followed him in. The inside of the house appeared just as feeble as the outside. Rain dripped through cracks in the wood. She could almost hear the critters scrambling below the floorboards. She looked at him with doubt, but he smiled and stepped aside for her to go first. Skeleton walls of planks made up this unfinished 3-story building. She assessed the narrow stairs that circled up in the middle of it, wondering if they wouldn't topple over under her weight. It didn't feel right. She couldn't be trusted around others. With all the excitement to eat, she had forgotten this simple fact. "You don't want me here," she said. "I'm dangerous." Danny smiled. "We all are." She looks at him quizzically. "In this house, you don't have to be different," he said. Several children and teens appeared throughout the building, their eyes seemingly to glow yellow in the dark. It wasn't right. She didn't belong. She turned to run, but a figure appeared before her in the doorway. The man from earlier, the one with the scars across his face. Danny nodded. "Kedrick." Kedrick looked down at her for a moment. He knelt, his eyes soft. "It wasn't your fault." "What?" Annabelle said, her voice catching. "How?" "The beast within killed your family because you couldn't control it." He reached out and took her by the shoulders. "Yet." Annabelle shrugged him off and took a step back. "Get out of my way." "So you can do it again?" She paused, unsure. "I have no one left to hurt." "No one? Can you take that chance?" Her eyes met his. Danny stepped up beside her. "You aren't alone. Not anymore." He held a hand. What could she think of this house of strangers? People who understood an evil part of her that she didn't even understand herself, that she didn't want to understand. She ducked past the man named Kedrick and took off in a sprint. The rain had picked up, stinging her face as she ran all out across the grass, through the muddy path and into town. Finally, as the rain died, she found herself at a park with lush trees and beautiful daisies. She kept moving at first, but stopped when she saw a young girl throwing a frisbee with her dog. The small girl ran to her mother and they hugged. A hug Annabelle knew she would never experience again. The dog spotted her and wagged its tail. "Stay away from me," Annabelle said softly. She turned to continue on, her destination unknown. Evening came, and she found herself walking past a row of restaurants. One with glass windows from floor to ceiling pulled her attention, and she paused, hand on her rumbling stomach. She stared at a plate of what appeared to be fried eggplant. She lingered, not noticing the patron's uncomfortable looks coming her way, until a very flamboyant waiter came out and shooed her off. Nowhere to go. She wandered until the city river flowed before her. She found a spot on a steel bridge and lowered herself to sit and peer into the deep green waters below. Having gone from the death of her parents to being homeless, and now this odd group of people in a battered house, she didn't know what to think. Why couldn't she just have a normal 13-year-old life? She leaned over and peered into the water, then leaned in just a bit more. Something below caught her eye, and she leaned to see it, something glinting, something that didn't belong. Her balance was off, and the bridge below her shifted, and she felt herself falling. A hand grabbed her coat and pulled her back. From where she lay on the ground, she looked up to see Kedrick's scarred face. "You can throw your life away." He kneeled down beside her like before. "But what a waste." She turned her gaze to the sky. "I want to be with them." "Your parents? Sure, you could die now, guilt-ridden over their death. Or you can come with me, prevent so many more." She stared into his eyes. "You have the chance to save lives, to bring good into the world. Using the same power you hate at this moment, I can teach you." He stood and reached out his hand. "You swear?" she said, and he nodded. She stood and stared at his hand. He nodded and retracted his hand before starting to walk. After a moment, she followed. That night, Annabelle climbed the stairs, a candle in her hand. Other children occupied a room here and there, reading by candlelight. She stopped at the doorless room where Kedrick stood. He gestured, and she entered. She placed the candle on a table beside a thick leather book. Kedrick noticed her eyeing the book and nodded. "Within are the answers." Her stomach grumbled. Kedrick reached out and messed her hair, and she let him. "Okay, study after eating." After what seemed the best meal she had eaten in weeks, stewed carrots and onions with potatoes, a side of eggs at her request, and a ripe tomato, she found herself being escorted into the basement with the other kids. Small windows lined the top of the south wall, revealing the night sky. Torchlight darted across the room, flickering on the walls and on the seated children. Young Annabelle found a spot among them, in dry, new clothes. Kedrick entered then, smiling, and began to pace before them. "I want you to welcome the newest member of our family," he said, and everyone nodded her way with solemn eyes. Kedrick pointed to the smallest boy, who must have been no more than 10. The boy jumped to his feet, back straight, and chest pushed out. "The sinners of the world shall fall before the light of the moon," the small boy said. "Good now." Kedrick turned to point at one of the older girls. She too jumped up straight. "To atone for our evils, we must remove all sinners from the world." Kedrick turned to Annabelle and smiled. "This is our calling, you see." She nodded in spite of her confusion. Kedrick spun around and pointed to Danny. On the back of Kedrick's neck, Annabelle took notice of a circle branded into his skin. Danny jumped up. "We show no mercy to those that oppose the light of the moon." The same marking was on his neck. Kedrick turned to Annabelle, and the torchlight seemed to dance in his eyes. "We are the hounds of God, his creatures sent to destroy the evil that plagues the earth. What you thought a curse, God has delivered unto the world as a blessing." Over the next week, Annabelle was surrounded by this talk. She trained with the other kids. There were the nights by the bed, with her face buried in books, the orange glow of the candlelight pushing the shadows aside, teasing them amongst as the light flickered, the wax overtaking the wick. There were days climbing the planks of the house like a jungle gym, hiding in shadows, moving in silence. But for what? She didn't know, but she didn't care because it made her forget her past. There was the training, the punching, dodging, kicking, and Danny, his arms around her while they laughed. It would have been like to have a brother. She would have liked that. After a week or so of it, she stood tall with the other children in the basement as Kedrick drew a chalk circle, a star in the middle. Annabel stared forward, her eyes fierce, her lip quivering with excitement to say the words she had been so scared of those first nights. He turned to the children with a nod of respect. In response, they sounded out as one. "We are the guiding light. We shall open the eyes of the world and illuminate the path toward righteousness." The next night, Danny and Annabel circled each other in the tall grass under a half-moon, Kedrick observing every movement. Danny came to her with a push kick, but she dodged, smiling. She was getting the hang of this. Kedrick shook his head. "When you transform, the beast will take over. You must harness it. Learn to control your inner flow." Her smile faded, and she turned to him, ready to ask what he meant. Her mouth was slightly open when Danny's fist took her in the chest. It wasn't hard, but she was knocked back. She jumped up, ready for another attack, determined to not let it happen again. Seeing the glimmer in his eye, the cocky tilt of his head, she moved for the offense. A series of rapid punches and kicks. Like always, Danny was too quick. Kedrick slammed his head against the nearby wall. "Your parents died to teach you a lesson. Now make proud." She grunted and took another shot from Danny, her smile gone. She screamed and attacked back, coming strong. For the first time, she connected, her leg on his, then a two-handed strike to his gut. With a yelp, Danny fell to the ground. She stood above him with yellow glowing eyes, fangs, and claws. Danny and Kedrick shared a look of shock. "And if I don't want this?" Annabel screamed, staring through her claws at Kedrick. He stepped forward, eyes dark and very serious. "After what you did to your family, you still think you have that choice?" She lowered her hands as they returned to normal, her head sunk. This was her family now, the only one she knew. Somehow it settled in at that moment. For the next few days, she was like a new girl, dedicated and ready for whatever Kedrick had to offer. When he told her to swing from the rafters or to climb from the second floor to the roof using her claws, she did it. During the day, her eyes were so close to her book she could smell the dusty scent of each page. When it came time to practice fighting with Danny, she was so focused that Kedrick soon began to watch in silence. This was where she belonged. But on a particularly rainy night, Annabel sat up with a start. She strained her ears, sure she had heard something. Lightning flashed outside. The sound came again, closer. A man's screams. She jumped out of bed and ran to the door of her room, where she could see the entryway and the front door as it burst open. A man stumbled in and fell to the ground, his shirtless body trembling. She gasped, and the man looked up, holding her gaze with a mixed look of terror and confusion. Kedrick followed through the front door, stooping to lift the man by his hair and drag him toward the basement stairs. Danny and the older girl followed. Kedrick stopped when his eyes caught Annabel. His free hand rose to point at her. "Get back in your room." She turned into her room and slammed the door, her white hand stark against the darkness. She lowered herself into a huddled ball, wondering what the look in the man's eyes had meant, and what Kedrick meant to do with him. The others had been leaving the house at night, looking worn down when they returned, a hollowness in their expression. What had they been up to? Hunting people like this man? She tried to go to sleep, but it was no good. Her eyes seemed held open by bars. Soon the shadows in the ceiling began to take on shapes, one a great wolf. She startled when the wolf moved, then noticed the door was open and Danny stood there, his eyes on the floor. She threw her feet to the floor and sat up. "Is he an evil man?" "So he says." Danny nodded slowly. "You know, I did it too. my parents. After that, it was either end it all or this. I'm scared. Danny reached for the door handle. Not for long, Annie. Annabelle waited until the quiet of the night seemed almost too quiet. She snuck out of her door, careful to make sure it didn't creak. She made her way down the stairs, descending along the side, heel to toe, so as to avoid being caught. She had to know what happened to the man. At the bottom of the basement stairs, she stopped, her legs shaking. She peeked around the door to see the man chained to the wall. Purple bruises covered his torso, and blood dripped from his mouth. She stepped in cautiously, knowing she shouldn't be there, but something about the man reminded her of her father. When she decided it was time to go, Kedrick appeared out of the shadows, his hand on her shoulder. She shrieked in surprise. The man in chains groaned. "I'm glad you came," Kedrick said. "Sometimes it's best not to obey." Annabelle glanced back to the stairway, but her legs wouldn't move. She knew she couldn't outrun Kedrick, and she had nowhere else to go. Kedrick released her, but not with his eyes. He walked to the man and began circling him, tracing his skin with a knife. "You're different," Kedrick said to her. "We only change on the full moon, but you're different." He stared at her for a moment. He shook his head as if trying to clear his thoughts. "Just be ready. When the transformation takes place, the hunger is suffocating." Kendrick's knife bit into the man's skin, emitting a trickle of blood. Kendrick leaned in close and sniffed. He licked the blood from his knife. "It's so bad," Kendrick said. "You may not be able to think. You black out and don't remember your actions. But that part you know all too well, don't you?" She tried to look away as Kedrick continued with the tiny slices on the man. Her eyes seemed to be cemented in place. Kedrick smiled. "We like to have one of them here to satiate our hunger when we transform." "Why him?" Annabelle said. "You know why. It's what I've been teaching you, why we are here. To punish him for the darkness in his heart." The man whimpered, and his chains rattled, and he seemed to resign himself to his fate. I never did anything wrong." Kedrick flicked the blade across the man's cheek. "You don't decide that." He glanced at the high windows. "Soon. 5, maybe 10 minutes." The man's eyes burst open, staring straight at Annabelle. Then he shook his head in sadness. "She's just a child." Kedrick backhanded the man before walking to the door. Annabelle followed, but he held out a hand. "No, you get first bite. I'll return when his screams cease." She tried to protest, but Kedrick was gone, and the door closed behind him. It was almost worse than when it had been the three of them. What had he said about blacking out? She couldn't handle it. She couldn't go through that, not again. She turned the man, her chin trembling. She knew what was going to happen, that she was powerless to stop it. "I'm sorry." He opened his eyes a slit, a slight upturn in his lips. My own daughter's no older than you. Please, believe me, I didn't, nothing. I don't want to hurt you." She looked down at her hands, the fingernails she knew would soon grow to claws, claws capable of ripping this man to shreds. But why should it have to be that way? She turned to the windows, small slits at the corner of stone basement walls, the full moon just visible behind a cloud. She gulped, and then turned to the man, ready to apologize again for what she knew she could not control. Any other night, but not on a full moon. Something about him at that moment, perhaps the way his hair fell, or the kindness in his eyes, it was too much. "I won't," she said, and then yelled it, "I won't!" She ran for the door, slamming into it with her shoulder. She pounded as hard as her little fists would allow, screaming until her strength left her and she sank to the ground, sobbing. She sat there for a moment, feeling hopeless, helpless. She had thought that perhaps this group stood for something, that they would be the ones stopping others from doing what she had done that horrible Christmas morning. Now she realized that was a dream. They were all like her. Evil. A twitch hit her chest. Her back convulsed, then harder, throwing her to the floor. She screamed as she writhed in pain, kicking the door. Her back arched and all went black, fading in and out with red, until an image became clear. It was her, that Christmas morning. Everything was blurry as she remembered that night. Everything but the sense of danger, knowing what was to come. She remembered the shadows twisting above her bed, a creak from the other room. She had gotten out of bed to use the toilet, then went to the living room in hopes of seeing Santa. She had poked her head into the living room, and there he was, her father, squatting in his Santa suit. He smiled up at her, and she never wanted to forget that smile, that lovely face she would never see again. "Go to bed, sweetie," he had said. As it came back, she wished more than anything that was what she had done. A creak had sounded and distracted her. She had turned to the open door, curious. Everything grew dark as she tried to remember. Then the images came like a flood, the shadow crawling across the floor, the dark form blocking out the full moon, the form monstrous and looming, hair glowing a dull red. A werewolf. Annabelle regained consciousness with a whimper. Her eyes slowly opened, and she turned to the man, still chained, staring back with confusion. She felt her fingernails, now claws, digging into the wood floor, everything growing dark. No, not dark, but losing color, turning black and white. The man's eyes widened, and he screamed, rattling the chains in an attempt to escape her. She looked down at the fur covering her hands, the long claws. Her eyes grew wide. No, 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 no! She turned to the door and pounded. Her body convulsed again. She threw all her weight into her strikes, the thuds echoing through the building until, with one massive swing, the door splintered before her. She stumbled back in amazement, glancing back at the man. He continued his struggle, yanking at the chains. Footsteps approached, and a moment later, Danny's worried expression appeared at the doorway. "What the—" Annabelle reached for him as if a rope was holding her back. "Danny, it's happening!" "Again?" Kedrick appeared behind Danny. Indeed. He stood in the doorway in a slight red glow. He stared at Annabelle as if she were a rare trinket. Annabelle grabbed her head and shut her eyes, shrieking. The images began again. She stood in her living room, the shadow of the beast before her. She took a step back, and the werewolf leapt in, straight for her father. She had screamed as it attacked, and again, as the first drop of blood hit her cheek. Her instincts had taken over, and she was out of control, running for the beast before her. With each step, she transformed into a werewolf. The two collided, and she knocked the attacker aside, swiping across its face with her claws. Then the image was over, and she was back in the basement with Kedrick, Danny, and the chained man. Now she understood the scars on his face, the unease she felt around him. The unease began to burn within her as it turned to hatred, fueling her desire for revenge. "You!" Kedrick looked at her, his expression at first puzzled, but then melting into understanding as she charged forward, snarling. Kedrick turned, pushing Danny aside in his retreat for the stairs, but Annabelle reached him, in full werewolf form now, and tackled him to the ground. As they struggled, she felt herself growing more, her fur giving off a golden glow that reflected on the scum of a man beneath her. He shrieked and squirmed as her claws and teeth bit into him. Her teeth sunk into his chest, and he howled in pain. The howl continued as he too transformed. Other howls answered throughout the building. Kedrick rose and tossed her off. She hit the far wall with a crack. He stumbled toward her, blood matted in his wolf hair. He lunged, but Danny intervened, changing too as he tackled Kedrick. Annabelle attempted to lift herself, howling as she felt her arms give out. She looked up to see Kedrick growl and grab Danny by the throat, spinning around to slam him to the ground. "No!" she screamed as she pushed herself to her feet. Kedrick turned on her, and she braced herself. A new energy seemed to flow around her, her fur glowing as if lit by the sun. With incredible speed, she ducked beneath his arms. She clawed at his legs and swung herself around to his back. Her teeth sunk into the rear of his neck, tearing flesh until she felt his neck crunch. He stumbled forward, collapsing to his knees, and still she clung. Hot, steaming blood entered her mouth and spewed around her, metallic liquid on her tongue. Still she clung, only releasing her bite when he stopped twitching. A puddle of blood at her feet. For a moment she stood in a stupor, that horrid taste on her tongue. Then she remembered Danny. She ran to him, throwing herself onto his unconscious body on the floor. "Danny!" she yelled. "Danny!" With a low moan, his eyes slowly opened. "Annie, don't worry, I'm here." He looked from her to Kedrick's limp body in human form. "What now?" She raised her eyes to see the other children in werewolf form standing in the doorway. She stood with claws at the ready, and they all looked to her, waiting. She rose, full realization taking over. She hadn't killed her parents. That had been the man that now lay dead by her doing. But this wasn't the end. She had believed in what they had taught her, that justice could be brought into the world, and that they had the power to do it. She could change at will. She could stop people from being hurt. She had already done it once tonight. Now she would set out into the world to protect the innocent, alone or not. "Now this man goes to his daughter," she said to Danny and the other werewolves. "The rest of you have a choice to make." This has been Night's Curse, a short story written by Justin M. Sloan, narrated by Rebecca Green. Copyright 2015.